So welcome to the Service Provider Vulnerabilities panel. That is not the right slide, but we'll have the right ones up there in a little bit. I am Martin Hannigan, and obviously I work for Versign. I work in the Network Security and Architecture Group in Dulles, Virginia. And we're here to just share some experiences with some of the recent vulnerabilities that have taken place on the Internet and how they've impacted operators. Basically, the abstract says it all. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce my panelists, and hopefully I have the right slides here. Okay, we got Patrick Gilmore from Akamai Technologies, myself, Aaron Hughes from Terremark, Chris Malayter from TDS, Chris Morrow from MCI, and Richard Steenbergen from nLayer. We have a commentary section that we've invited Jerry Dixon from US CERT to speak, and we've also invited Robert Matthews from the University of Hawaii to speak. And we're going to stop here for a second because now we need the right slides.
How'd you get it?
Yeah, Bill. Bill, how did you get that? My laptop's dead.
Fun.
Should be on my computer, right? SanDisk, it's still loading. There we go.
So how much porn do you have on this drive, Bill?
Okay, we've got it. Yeah. Thank you, Bill.
That doesn't look like the right one.
Okay, so we're back to the abstract slide. So the only thing we left out is this is hopefully a precursor to an additional session in 35 in Los Angeles. Or has that been announced? Well, wherever 35 is going to be. Problems worthy of attack prove their worth by fighting back, and I think this is something that rings true with most operators. I'll quickly go through the introductions again since we have the bios up. Pat Gilmore is Director of Network Strategy and Support at Akamai. He's been there for the last 5 years, helping to build the largest CDN in the world. Patrick has experience with large network design deployments in both the ISP and enterprise spaces, and prior to working at Akamai, he was the Chief Network Architect for Onyx, and he worked for Concentric and was Director of Operations at Priority. My bio is a little wordy, but I've been around for quite a while and been involved in quite a few things, and I'm still here. Aaron, I'm also lucky enough to help run the mailing list. Aaron Hughes is currently the Vice President of Technology at Terremark, a leading operator of Internet exchange points. Mr. Hughes is responsible for all network and system topology planning and design. Prior to Terremark, Mr. Hughes is Vice President of Operations at Yellowbricks, where he led operations, sales, engineering, planning, and design. Aaron's also worked at Certainty Solutions, Quest Technologies, RCN, Ultranet, and Channel One Communications. And I actually knew Aaron back when he worked at Channel One, which was about 10 years now. Chris Malayter, we all know. He's a data network engineer at TDS in Madison, Wisconsin. He's held a number of roles there. In his current position, he's responsible for designing, engineering, and running the data networks that comprise TDS's internet business. Chris was a primary player in the redesign of the TDS nationwide core network. In addition, he's responsible for all the internet pairing coordination. Chris Morrow, he's network security engineer with MCI for the last 5 years. In real life, he's a chemical engineer. While at UUNET MCI, he's been responsible for a team of engineers helping them mitigate DOS attacks against their customers. Additionally, he's been responsible for evaluating security issues and their relevance to UUNET, UUNET's public IP backbone, and other MCI networks. Richard Steenbergen joins us. He's the founder of nLayer Communications. He currently serves as the CTO. Previously, he was a senior network engineer for several large NSPs and a senior software engineer developing routing technologies at NetVMG. Jerry Dixon, he joins us. He's Deputy Director of Operations for NCSD, U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, U.S. CERT. Prior to joining NCSD, he was a Director of the Internal Revenue Service's Computer Security Incident Response Capability, IRSCSIRC, as they're known, including, and it's scary to get email from them when you see that IRS. Okay. Including having served as Director of Information Security for Marriott International, a global private sector company. Mr. Dixon is currently a CISSP, and actively engaged with public and private sector efforts in the information security community. Professor Matthews joins us on the telephone. He is a distinguished senior research scholar on national security affairs and U.S. industrial preparedness at the University of Hawaii. A domain specialist in ultra-complex systems, Professor Matthews' professional concentrations over the past 3 decades include nonlinearity and highly distributed large-scale systems and emergent behavior as those found in command control, communications, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, C3 ISR systems. Additionally, he serves as Senior Policy and Programs Analyst to the United States government on a variety of national security matters, which include U.S. critical infrastructures, national technical assets, the intelligence community, counterterrorism, and domestic security. Professor Matthews holds advanced degrees in both management and economics, and welcome to everybody. So the way that we've set the panel up today is we have each panelist is going to answer one question, and we're going to have a little bit of debate amongst the panelists if needed. After the last question, Jerry Dixon's going to address the audience, and then Professor Matthews is going to address the audience. So with that, I think we'll get started. The first question is... And this question is going to be answered by Patrick Gilmore. If one company discovers a vulnerability and the impact is in its infancy, is it worth announcing it to all customers and/or the operator community? And the follow-on to that will be, does that create a larger vulnerability?
Hello. So I'm going to answer the second question first because it's easier. The answer is obviously yes. Anytime you have a secret and you give more people the information of that secret, it's higher likelihood that the secret will leak out. I don't think anybody's going to have any problem with that. People might have a problem with my answer to the first question. The first question can be broken up into 2 subsets. There's obviously vulnerabilities that aren't going to do any damage to the internet. Those kind of vulnerabilities I honestly think should be announced whenever they come out. If it's not going to do any damage, let us know. We'll work around what small effects they can have. Don't worry about hiding them. The second type of vulnerability is kind that do affect the internet on a large basis, can take out large providers or entire swaths of the core of the internet, as they say. That type of vulnerability can further be broken down into 2 more sets, the kind with workarounds and the kind without workarounds. The kind with workarounds is going to be addressed at a later question, so I'm going to let that go. The kind without workarounds, personally, and I need to stress this is me, not my company, not my CEO, not the rest of the panel, but personally I think that that should not be announced. I think if you found a vulnerability, if you're a router vendor and you've noticed a Stack Overflow that there's no workaround for, this should be kept secret. It should be worked on internally until there is an answer. You should not let it out. You shouldn't let anybody else know about it. Obviously, if it becomes known for whatever reason, if somebody else finds it or if it leaks out of your organization, that's a different story. But as long as you do not think there's a vulnerability, an exploit in the wild for this vulnerability, you shouldn't let anybody else know. Talked about this with a few of you out there and lots of people who aren't here today. And there was a suggestion which I think it might be helpful. And that is, if you are a vendor and you found that there is a vulnerability and there's no workaround, you start working on the bug. Most people can tell when they're going to be able to have code available for the fix. It's not an exact science, but most people can tell, most vendors can tell when the bug fix is going to be available. It might be useful if what you did is announce to the community that there's going to be an upgrade, a path for iOS, JuneOS, whatever the bug is in a week, 2 weeks, whatever, Friday at 4 o'clock on May 26th or whatever is available. This was asked from several people because they did not want to find out on Friday at 4 o'clock after everybody in Europe had gone home that they have this massive vulnerability and they need to upgrade all their routers today. They'd like to schedule maintenance windows. I found that to be reasonable. There was some comments about, well, what's going to happen? Are people going to assume this is a bug? Of course they're going to assume it's a bug. But a lot of times you don't have enough information, or it may not be possible to give out information without giving away the vulnerability. And even if people are going to assume it's a bug or notice that their upstreams are upgrading their routers or anything else, it's still nice to know the information ahead of time so that you can schedule, have resources available, and get ready to do this upgrade once you know what's going on and you can make a decision at that time. It's a lot better than trying to scramble. So that's my answer to the question. Any questions from the panel?
Thanks, Patrick.
That was too easy.
Question 2 is to Chris Malayter, and the question is announcing a vulnerability putting tools into script kiddies, hackers, angry people's hands, and could this be prevented? With a follow-on of, should vulnerability announcements be restricted to a selective group to prevent this?
I think that the first part of the question is yes and no. I don't think that there's a clear-cut, definitive answer from everything that I've read and everybody that I've talked with. There's definitely different levels of sophistications of vulnerabilities. Some vulnerabilities are easy to reproduce and create a tool set to take advantage of that vulnerability, and some are not. Some are very easy to exploit in the wild, while others are not. So I think the first half of the question is really a common sense. How easy is this going to be to exploit, and how much of an impact is it going to have? If it's not going to have much impact, then that probably changes it to be a yes. To the second half, I believe really strongly in this. We actually went quite a few rounds with vendors on this year, that releasing information to a subset of the people is definitely not the way to go. When vulnerabilities are released, generally they're fixed in versions of code that are already out, or there's already workarounds that are available to go with it. Regardless of what the community, the small community that holds the information thinks, once that subset group receives a vulnerability information and what the workaround is or what the patch versions of code are, generally the other operators in the operator community that didn't get it aren't very far behind getting the information through back channels, the whisper net of sorts.
So would you say that your opinion is basically within full disclosure?
I would say that if you're going to give it out, that we should look at some form of opt-in system to get trusted people within corporations the information that they need. I don't necessarily know that giving it to the general public is the right answer, but I firmly believe that limiting it by whatever CATA score or whatever subset of determining factor that we're using is giving a competitive differentiator to a commodity-based service. So and this is definitely something that happened. You had large providers who were marketing the fact that they were getting information before other people, and I don't believe that that's fair, and I believe that that definitely has to be avoided.
Patrick, would you say that your opinion on this, on the previous slide, would be more responsible disclosure?
I don't.
Okay.
I could just talk real loud. Okay. I'm not sure that they actually overlap, because I was saying that I was asked whether or not the vulnerability should be released at all, and the answer is I don't think it should unless there's a workaround, and then that's going to be covered elsewhere. If it is going to be released, although I haven't thought up my complete answer to this, I certainly don't find any fault in what Chris is saying. It does give a competitive advantage to the people, and I do know that some of the people who got, ignoring the press release incident, I do know that sales guys from the big networks were telling their customers, you should go with us because if anything happens, we get it first. This wasn't necessarily written down, but the sales guys were saying this in sales meetings. And that's, that does do something to my sense of fairness. Not necessarily that the world should be fair, but it is a problem.
Okay, thanks. Question 3. This question is going to be addressed by Aaron Hughes. What if routers, switches, and network objects had a smart update feature, much like Windows Update or software update for you Apple users? Would this end the continuous and massive spread of viruses, IRC bots, open relays, and could the average enterprise deal with a regular 3 a.m. reload, approximately a 5-minute outage?
So I know this is a controversial issue, and it'll certainly at least raise a bunch of opinions about ways to implement it and definitions of knobs, or even if it's possible. So leaving that aside, this is my thoughts on the issue. I've not completed the research on this here, so there's no empirical evidence that the next statement is 100% accurate, and I'm sure if Casey Claffey were up here, she'd bump me on the head. That being said, I'm making a general assumption that ISPs and IXs and carriers deal with amplifiers continuously. And those amplifiers are generally downstream of the ISPs, IXs, and carriers. So this slide really focuses on the enterprises and alike. This is proposing that we change the default on the routers to be more secure. That is, block the majority of the inbound traffic, change the default so that we somehow detect the public inside space, and by default install anti-spoof filters. And of course the big controversial issue is we somehow set up some sort of auto update where routers, much like Windows and OS X boxes, check for updates on some regular basis and automatically fix the routers. How great would that be? So there's lots of questions that come out of this. First, can enterprises deal with a 5-minute outage on a somewhat regular basis? Can they modify customer SLAs to allow for this kind of maintenance? And on the other extreme, would some enterprises even notice? And what will this really solve? So perhaps we'll reduce the number of viruses or open relays or attacks on unsecured hosts. I believe it will. I also believe that this would be enough of a change that the impact of a somewhat regular code update and a reboot would be far less impact than the average big attack, whatever the next one may be. That's it for this slide.
Mark,
Go
just
ahead, Chris.
have one quick question. So I'm not sure how routers having some auto update feature is going to do anything for bots or open relays at all. But personally, I just don't see it because they're not generally bots or open relays. Aside from some cases I'm sure Rob Thomas will come talk about.
I absolutely agree that auto update won't necessarily fix those things, which is why I also mentioned the sort of default config on the router. I'd really like to see that out of the box it is secure. It's hard to get packets in and out of your network. It should be that you should only have inbound permitted for things that are normal services, and if anti-spoof were implemented by default, if we can magically figure that out somehow on all of the edges, our big core fabrics wouldn't be amplified and attacked constantly by these hosts on the other side of them.
Okay. The last part was that oftentimes the fixed code isn't really fixed. So, I mean, auto update for your Mac OS box when oh crap, my OS is down. Well, I get that recovery CD and reboot
Sure.
it. That's good, but when it's my T640, or actually we don't have those, so if it's my M160, that's not good.
Sure.
If I lose a whole region, that's a big problem.
And that's why I was making this sort of assumption, right? That this is not for ISPs, not for IXs.
Yeah, maybe that's a fair statement for the home user, cable modem, DSL, up to a certain size enterprise customer. Maybe that's an acceptable solution.
And I don't know what the size is, but if we had the knobs to control it, and we could at least propose something that was sort of the standard, and you can turn this all off, of course, but it's an idea. It's an idea for dealing with this.
What's the difference between this and auto update, something that we recently, what was that called?
Auto secure?
Auto secure. What would be the difference?
I really haven't looked much into how auto secure works, and so I don't know the answer. I don't believe that downloads code. I think that helps you close out known vulnerabilities.
I'm not 100% sure about auto update or auto secure's features. I'm sure there's a Cisco person or somebody who wants to say.
So hold on a minute. We can no, don't go away. We can take some questions, but we've got a lot to talk about, and we were hoping to take the questions at the end. But if we're not lining the microphones up, but Steve Wilcox, and then I can take a question from you.
You asked for questions before, so I thought I'd give you some. Assuming that you're not going to use this for large ISPs, enterprise, or AXs, so we're talking about end users, it may be worth comparing. Remember the Netgear thing where they had that NTP DOS built into the firmware? And when they did the fix for it, there was like 1 million boxes deployed. Virtually none of them could be contacted or updated because the boxes were just deployed in dumb end user sites and weren't configured and didn't have anything. So I'm not sure when you get a network device in an end user site, you would actually have this feature enabled, because the boxes wouldn't be able to call home. Just like so.
Who are you and who are you with?
Joel Krauske, I work for Cisco. What if it wasn't managed by the company, your vendor, but it was something you could manage internally, and it helps you roll out your software updates across your network? You know, the feature should be customizable that you could do that. I mean, if you're a Microsoft customer, you're not getting your updates from Microsoft Direct. If you're a big enterprise, you have your own internal server where you choose what updates you want to push out.
Okay, Bruce Campbell. Do you trust the update mechanism? Or can you trust the update mechanism? I see he shakes their heads. But, the real fear is the evil hacker getting control of the auto-update mechanism, and bang, they've got control of your routers.
Well, you could just as easily ask the same question about your hosts and operating systems, right? I mean, do you trust that the next Windows update or OS X update is going to cover the next vulnerability or fix some problem or cause more problems than you had to begin with?
Yeah, Chris's thing of the scope for auto-updating routers, the scope for damage is much greater than auto-updating operating systems.
Thank you. No. Aaron also took question number 4. As Code Red and IMDA have proven, blended threats can wreak havoc on enterprise security because they evolve more rapidly, are progressively more complex, and occur more frequently than past attack methods. The worst threats are likely to come. So, with that context, why are the most affected companies, enterprises, not managing bug fixes and vulnerabilities until they are reacting to an attack? Is it too hard to manage those changes? And are the network engineers simply too expensive? And has marketing led enterprises to believe we are living in a self-healing world? That's a good one, Aaron.
So there's this great ad campaign I'm sure most of you have seen on TV. I believe it was put out by IBM where they advertise the self-healing server technology. They even go on as far to say, they sprinkle this sort of self-healing magic pixie dust on their servers, and all their engineers leave a smile on their faces with confidence that everything's going to work great. They go on to clearly tell you that there's no such object, but that there should be better reliability for servers. And so the point that I want to make here is that there are several ad campaigns which are marketing attempts to educate the enterprises about server reliability. But I very rarely see commercials advertising self-healing network or encouraging reliability on network and switches. I would even go as far as to state that enterprises pay very little attention to routers and switches and may not even realize that they're susceptible to vulnerabilities or know that you have to upgrade them in a lot of cases. So the lack of education happens for a lot of reasons. Generally, smaller companies don't have network engineers, but rather have MIS managers who run servers. And the MIS managers may know how to put in a basic config in a router, or may even know how to upgrade a router once in a while. But they're simply too busy or focused on other things, or it's not tied to revenue, and their managers and CEOs aren't hearing it enough that they know that it's important to spend the money and time to take care of these objects. And network engineers are too expensive for the average enterprises. Even if they were less expensive, and full-time network engineer is probably just not needed for the average enterprise, and would likely be bored with the one router and 4 switches that they have. You got something to say there, bud?
I'm thinking.
That'll take a
I'm
while.
not sure I'm clear on how network engineers are too expensive for the enterprise since they get them anyhow.
Okay, so the average enterprise.
And typically on the enterprise you see CCIE, CCNA, and they tend to, I think, draw a little bit more money than your average, not necessarily an NSP guy, but I mean if we're talking economics, I think.
I wish I would have done some more research for the actual average numbers, but I'm thinking somewhere along the lines of the company that has small server farms and they provide services to people and have a router because they need to connect to the internet and have switches because they need to connect all their servers to their routers. And I would think that that's probably more average than it is you know, I think there's a smaller number of very large enterprises that have good internal expertise.
So mostly like SMBs, small to medium businesses?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I do not believe we as an operator community, I do believe that we as an operator community frequently come to the conclusion that educating people is generally a good thing and is needed to help secure up the internet. But I would also like to see our focus change somewhat into looking at automatically securing and changing the defaults to make it harder to be insecure. So that's generally what this is about.
I have a feeling no matter what the defaults are, someone will find a way to be insecure.
Okay, question 5 is directed to Richard Steenbergen. On April 20th, 2004, a vulnerability was found in MD5. Service providers were required to react swiftly to enable passwords on BGP sessions globally. The question is, if there is a workaround available before the software fix is in, e.g. BGP MD5, should it be announced publicly before the vulnerability, or should affected parties be notified privately?
Marty, we have a question too.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who are you and who are you with?
Sandy Murphy from Sparta. The first line, on April 20th, 2004, vulnerability was found in MD5. It wasn't MD5, it was TCP. It wasn't found, it was publicized. It wasn't a vulnerability, it was a well-known but somewhat unfortunate feature. Got the date right.
Well, that's a good point, but roll with us here. I think we'll get to the point. Joel, did you want to say something? Good. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Well, that's basically what I was going to say regarding this specific issue. You know, as far as the answer, should the workaround be published? Really, the answer is it depends. It depends on how easy it is to reconstruct the actual attack. It depends on what the attack is, how easy it is to exploit, or in the case of the TCP vulnerability, if it's even an issue at all. Most knowledgeable engineers with regard to the TCP reset vulnerability already knew that was how TCP worked, that was how it was meant to work. There was nothing new there. It wasn't a vulnerability. It wasn't a serious issue. And the fact that the information was leaked so slowly and with so much secrecy really caused a lot of people to run around deploying MD5 where they didn't need to, resulted in a lot of pissed off engineers later. In some other instances, you know, some historical examples, the vendors have given out a little bit too much information. There have been workarounds, but they've disclosed so much. You know, here's what to filter, and here's exactly why it happens, and they've provided so much detail that it was immediately easy to reconstruct the attack, and within, you know, you would see months that the code had been fixed, had been built into various releases, and then within 48 hours of the notice being put out, they had given out so much information for the workaround that you were seeing exploits in the wild. So that's where you're going too far on the other side. So really the answer is you need to use some common sense. We need to get the information out there where it makes sense, where it's not going to be so completely obvious that you can reconstruct the attack. You know, if there is a workaround and it's reasonable enough to do, you know, you can tell your customers that if you're not running MPLS, you're not going to be affected by this bug, instead of leaving them all confused and bewildered.
Can I ask just a couple of questions for Richard? So, unless you had something.
No, go right ahead.
So, first off, oftentimes, unfortunately, with some of the vulnerabilities, the details about the vulnerability are relevant to the fix. So, the fix for Patrick's network might be different than the fix for your network, might be different from the fix for my network or from Woody's network. And knowing how the actual problem exists and what you have in your network oftentimes helps arrive at a better solution for you, aside from upgrade code and pray that that code actually works, which sometimes it doesn't. You had a point about, you know, the MD5 issue did cause a lot of folks to run around and install MD5 passphrases on BGP, which I agree at the time seemed sort of nutty, but, you know, if I tell you to jump or you actually do that, you know, you have to have some common, you said common sense, the operators need to have some common sense as well as to what possibility, you know, what they're doing, what they're implementing. I think at the time, Patrick actually, and he should probably comment on this, he was saying that he had people requiring him to do MD5. Is that correct?
At the time, management decided that based on information that they were...
No, I thought that you had actually said on the mailing list that you had some of your providers requiring you to do MD5.
Yeah, at the time, we did have actually upstream providers requiring us to do MD5 or they were going to shut down our links. And we didn't have any information on why, didn't understand it, and once we figured it out, we turned it off.
Yeah, we saw a little overreaction too.
Yeah.
And afterwards, when I went to ask those providers, the answer was they didn't know either, that somebody at the TAC told them, and in fact, in some cases, they told them the TAC didn't know any better, but they were doing it anyway.
So how many people did the upgrade or the fix just because? Any hands? Anybody willing to admit that?
So, I mean, maybe that specific example is good for a number of reasons, but maybe it's also a bad example because people just reacted, I think, like people with their hair on fire for no particular reason. I mean, if there's no information...
You have to have some to get it on fire.
Maybe that's what happened to your hair. And also, Richard has he said does something that I do actually more often than my wife would like. I imply people's knowledge about stuff. Like you're implying that people really understand how TCP works, and I don't think that that's the case by and large. If you go back to the example of the network, the standard network operator at an SMB or
Apparently we're sorry.
Okay, I just wanted to point out, the person who pointed out the slide that the terminology was basically in error, I think that was a good demonstration of, so this panel is basically made up of operators, the people that deal with this stuff on a day-to-day basis, and sometimes we don't always completely understand the things that we're seeing, and we're under so much pressure that we have to react with a snap and then circle back around. So thank you for pointing that out. Steve Wilcox? Speak up, I can't hear you.
A point to Chris. You were just picking on Patrick there.
just because he made a point, that's all.
Doesn't everybody?
We went and rolled MD5 out based upon what we were told from a number of different vendors and agencies. We were told we needed to do it. We were told there was a vulnerability, and this is a bad example for this reason, but it was sometime afterwards, quite a long time afterwards, when we actually found out the specifics of the vulnerability and realized there wasn't a vulnerability. So it's unfair to say that people reacted. We were told categorically there was a major issue, and we reacted to it as we've been told to react.
Steve Feldman?
This works. Oh, there it goes. I would
Okay,
like
back
to
up.
point out that from my point of view, which is a content provider, we were being told to do this by people that we trusted to be right. And the feeling was, we trust these people. If we don't do it, we might be in trouble, so we better do it. It wasn't terribly difficult for us, and I don't regret doing it. In hindsight, yeah, maybe it wasn't needed. In hindsight, maybe I need to question the trust that I have for some of the sources. But I think I reacted correctly based on the information I was given. And I suspect most of the people around here would agree with that. So it really becomes an issue then of who do you trust to tell you to jump, and deciding if you trust them before you jump.
No.
So overall, you didn't really care either way about the end of the problem. I mean, and you don't have the same problem that Patrick has about maintaining keys all over the place, or like we have maintaining keys for God knows how many customers who want password as their key. Whatever. Well, I'm just saying that this is a good example because everyone knows what it is, but it's not a good example because it really wasn't handled very well. It wasn't handled. Maybe that's a great example. It wasn't handled very well, but I think looking over the history of incidents that I've been involved with, they're getting better. This one maybe was a step backwards, but they're getting better to some extent. Like the SNMP issue that came out was that was a complete nightmare. So I guess there's several SNMP incidents, but.
Okay, we're going to move on to question 6. Question 6 is for Chris Morrow. There are multiple methods of vulnerability announcements that impact the operator community. Those include the Whisper Network, and basically the Whisper Network is you work at Tier 1 ISP and you call me and go, "Psst, I just heard about this thing and I'm letting you know about it." NSPsec, NANOG, and INOC DBA, and also vendor reporting methods like PCERT. So the question is, what is the most expedient path to get the information to ISPs to collaboratively determine mitigations in the absence of a patch? Would we feel compelled to share the mitigation of the same outside of the U.S. region? And is the Whisper Network a good or bad thing?
So I will try to not ramble so much on my answer, but so the collaboration issue, my feeling is that, like I said to Richard, everybody's network is architected differently. Everybody made design decisions during that impact every vulnerability's effect on their level of risk from that vulnerability. So I'm not sure that collaboratively me calling up somebody and saying, "I heard about blah, you should do this," is helpful, because I don't know what their network looks like, so me telling them that isn't going to be necessarily helpful. So maybe that's a little bit difficult. I do think that if you have information about some particular vulnerability and you need to be careful who you share it with. There's a lot of people in the world who wish harm on other folks or other networks, and that's difficult. So if you find something and tell the vendor about it, running around and telling all your best friends and posting it on a mailing list maybe is not the best option.
And also, in many cases, that would be violating an NDA, which is not such a smart thing to do, right?
Right, that's true. Violating NDAs gets me in trouble. So I think that's the first question, sort of. Feeling compelled to share it outside of the U.S. region. As a multinational corporation, I don't really have a whole lot of choice. If some vendor tells me about something, I have parts of my company that are in Asia-Pac and EMEA that I have to make aware of the problem and make aware of the fix that we plan on implementing in the U.S. at least. Our operations group doesn't necessarily dictate operations everywhere, and that goes by the operations group as well, which is always fun. So I don't have a lot of choice. Now, did I tell the Indian government about it? No. I don't tell my customers about it either. So, I mean, there have been plenty of incidents where we prepared a customer statement and prepared a statement to the government because we knew they were going to ask us about it. But, it's not our responsibility to tell the customer anything. And when they ask, we really just say, "Hey, you should go talk to Cisco about this. Here's the web page," and we give them a little primer on what the problem is.
How do your customers react when you tell them that, typically?
Most times they call in and they're just confused. They don't really understand. This is what I was saying about the implied knowledge. They don't necessarily know. So they don't understand what the problem is. They're just looking for a heads up and what did we do. So a lot of times, like, "Are you fixing this?" "Yes, we are." Or,
So when you get a large vulnerability that gets a lot of press, does your call center phones ring off the hook and your ticket queues load up really heavily? And
yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the particular incident, but we definitely have had those where the call centers got very, very congested. And so it caused us headache, and so that's why we prepared a statement and said, "Hey, here's what we can tell." We prepare something that they can email the customer, something they can speak to the customer about, some talking points that have some more detail, and then we say, "And by the way, the vendor documents for this are also very good." So.
All set. Guys. Okay, thank you.
Well, I just had my last point I didn't get to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. It's one I didn't want to answer, but so is the Whisper network, is it good or bad? And I think it depends on how it's run. Having a system that's like the telephone game is difficult because I tell you, you tell somebody, and by the time it gets back around to me, it's a totally different story. So it's very, very challenging to do any kind of secure, quiet communications on something that's going to be very public.
Do you think, in the case of the TCP/MD5 vulnerability, that the Whisper network may have contributed to the overreaction of most of the people that overreacted?
Yeah, I think that if you look at that incident, that's why I kept trying to say maybe this wasn't the best incident to use.
Yeah.
And say it before you prepared your slides, unfortunately. I think that if I hear something is bad and I tell Chris, and he trusts me, and he doesn't ask why is this bad? Explain to me the problem. Explain to me how this is bad for me. And then he makes an educated decision about, and again, I'm just using Chris as an example, not to poke fingers at him. But, just don't feel bad. If he doesn't fully understand it and he just goes and implements something and turns around and tells his engineering and operations group to go and implement something, then we end up with a situation like the TCP MD5 issue, or the TCP issue.
I don't think that's actually what happened, because I know everyone I talked to and I know what I did when I was told, which was, why should we do this? What's wrong? Can you tell me more? And the answer was, no, go do this. And since people like your vendors, Tony telling me, well, if you don't trust your vendors, how we write the code, you have to trust us. Or people like our transit providers telling us, well, you need to do this. We've done this on our network. I mean, who are you going to trust? And what's going to happen next time there really is a vulnerability and this is the only information you have? I really don't think it's because people just went, oh, wow, I heard about this. Somebody mentioned it over dinner one day and I think I'm going to change my entire network because of it.
Yes, I made an overly simplified example, but you did say in what you said in your statement earlier that your provider told you, do this or we're going to shut your link down, your session down, and you asked why, and they said, we don't know why. And then later on, you asked the next person up the line, and they said, we never really did find out what was up with that.
That's right.
So,
I mean, they were all doing it, and they all told me to do it. What else are you going to do?
But that's what I'm saying is that, if you can't make an educated decision about it, then and maybe that's also part of the problem, is you need to have the information. The last little point about that is that oftentimes the folks that get involved with that are non-helpful. So when my execs hear about it, I have to have like twice daily calls with people about stuff so I don't get anything done except preparing for calls. If the government people hear about it, they want twice daily calls about this incident. And again, no work gets done. Same with PR. So there's a point when all those people do have to get involved, but early on is not the time. And during the actual fix is not the time, as much as possible.
Okay, thanks. Joel?
When your vendors and people in your government come to you and say, install TCP MD5 or else, that's not disclosure, right? And so, of course, that's going to hit the whisper network, right? People are going to expose that, and yes, they're going to overreact because they have no way to make intelligent decisions about deploying functionality in their network. So it shouldn't come as a shock to anyone that that sort of information would leak out, or that without disclosure as to what was actually going on, that people might overreact.
I think it goes back to slide 2 that I spoke to, that I hear it from Chris, who tells me about this, and he tells me that I need to put MD5 on all my sessions. And since my vendor flat out refuses to tell me what's going on, I take what is the next best hope that I have to protect my network if the exploit comes out into the wild without the vendor disclosing it to us before it comes out into the wild. And I take my friend here, Chris, who called me up and said, you need to do this. I'll take his word over the vendor who won't, I don't have a word from the vendor because they won't tell me anything. So I think that a lot of the, especially in this case, the TCP MD5 stuff came from vendors following their closed practices and the web of trust of sorts of operators responding within that.
We also have a minor, well, not so minor issue with lack of a single definitive source of information. There's a bunch of different communities all over the globe that all have to deal with these kind of issues and figuring out how to disseminate the information. And we don't know if it should go to the NANOG or INOC DBA or come from CERT or NSPSec or Homeland Security or what. This is this big question. So all of these sources of information we all keep up with, sort of, when we can get through our mailing lists and everything else, and come to our own conclusions about what we think is appropriate to respond to. And we need to come up with some way that says, this is really important to everybody. This is really important to people running MPLS. This is really important to people still running ERGRP or something like that. And instead of having this big noisy list, have something that's rather selective and directed.
Okay, thank you. Next we're gonna bring up Jerry Dixon from the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. CERT, and he's going to address a question for us. Jerry, are you here? Okay. Yeah, you can do it from that microphone. The question for Jerry Dixon is, what role should the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. CERT, have resolving issues surrounding vulnerability release? Jerry and I had a discussion a little bit earlier, and I told him to feel free to kind of veer off a little bit and shape this to something a little bit more general. So go ahead, Jerry.
I think there's been a lot of good discussion on how to communicate vulnerabilities. One of the, just to add on to what you're talking about, who do you go to, and how do you I've got a question. I guess it's a little bit higher level. How do you kind of triage that vulnerability? How do you know the severity of it? How do you how many of y'all have like a vulnerability scoring system within your organization, whether you're an operator or a vendor? Just a show of hands. Okay. How many
Jerry,
of you have?
I'm not sure everybody heard that because I'm having trouble hearing you. So maybe you can do that again.
How many of you have a mechanism in place to score a vulnerability or assess the criticality of it from a whether you're an operator or a vendor, just by a show of hands? Okay. Well, one of the challenges, and I think from a U.S. CERT perspective, situational awareness and these kind of things are kind of key. Based on we deal with a lot of national level incident response teams. With foreign governments, we've got partnerships in place with those organizations, and a lot of times, more often than not, they'll come across exploit code, or they might have find a vulnerability being exploited, but don't yet have the code, but they're at least communicating that information. And if we've got somebody, on the U.S. side, whether it's an operator or a group, that we can kind of say, hey, this activity is going on, we need to ratchet up the criticality of it to determine, what makes sense on communicating it. I'll use an example that comes up quite often is DHS was talking with the DNS community, and in trying to determine, what should get reported to, say U.S. CERT, and one of the folks there, said, well, we'd be interested if DNS is being attacked. Well, of course, the DNS community said, well, we're getting attacked, every few seconds. So what is the right threshold, for what constitutes a national level event to determine, what should get communicated, how does it get communicated, as well as take into account for when is the vendor going to have a patch available for folks. And one of the things that we're interested in working, especially with the, the NANOG community, is trying to figure out how do we, reach out to find out, in the absence of a patch, because sometimes it takes a couple of weeks, but there's a lot of malicious activity taking place. What are some of the steps to mitigate it? How do we get that information into us? I think on the previous slide, it mentioned a couple of different closed mailing lists, the INOC DBA. One of the things that, another thing that U.S. CERT would be interested in is what makes the most sense in communicating things in a secure fashion, as well as also keeping in mind, the interconnected nature of the internet and dealing with the international community as well. So again, it's just just some general things. I know we'll be here over the next couple of days. There's a couple of us. If you have thoughts on that, be interested in hearing those. One of the things I wanted to point out too is how many of you know exactly what U.S. CERT does outside of the vulnerability context? Okay. Well, basically, just to give you a quick rundown, we're responsible for incident coordination across the federal government. So if something's happening within a particular agency, say within the Department of Treasury, say like IRS, if they identify, a new piece of malware that's not currently being detected, or if they're having an intrusion set within their environment, that gets reported up. We help bring additional resources or help with analysis if they request it. But it gives us a general picture of what's taking place across government. We interface with the White House, the National Security Council, Homeland Security Council, and the Office of Management and Budget on a regular basis to let them know what's happening across the federal government space, to determine impacts, and if there's any trends there that need to be identified. The other piece that we're charged with is infrastructure protection, working with companies that like chemical companies, oil companies, financial sector, banks, that type of thing, in providing cybersecurity guidance, also helping them with understanding what the threats are out there. The other piece that we deal with is a lot of times we deal with a lot of getting direct calls from private citizens, state governments, local governments requesting assistance if they have a major intrusion set, providing on-site response if needed. Also, if we've had organizations contact us with regards to if they're not getting traction with their local law enforcement, we're able to get federal law enforcement engaged and get them assistance to help with attribution or to stop the pain that they're feeling. One of the things that we're excited, the last couple of years that providers have been doing, and actually I need to grab a drink of water because I'm kind of going dry here. One of the things that the providers have been doing is providing anti-spyware, antivirus, kind of helping with where a major problem lies. A lot of times with the end user, either clicking on attachments or initiating a worm or those types of things. That's a constant battle. There's a lot of large providers that are providing the anti-spyware, the antivirus software, enforcing the acceptable use policies. A lot of times when we get contacted about botnets on either a drone or the command and control, and being able to reach out to ISPs, a lot of them have been very responsive in enforcing their acceptable use policy. I'd like to see that trend continue on because it helps, one, reduce the amount of systems out there that are causing everybody problems.
So Jerry, when you call an ISP and ask them to enforce their AUP, do they typically cooperate, or what's your typical response?
Basically, we typically will reach out if we don't have our own direct contact. You kind of touch on the Whisper network. We use that vehicle, based on folks that we know, but we also reach out to abuse departments. In the last couple of months, we've been passing information to internet service providers, and they, have gotten back to us rather quickly and have, basically they tell us that they're enforcing the acceptable use policy. However, if there's the trick for us is because we have embedded law enforcement is to make sure that we're not also trampling on something that they might be working. If they are working something, then they'll be the conduit to reaching out to that internet service provider under, basically the subpoena process or the other mechanisms that they have to enforce getting that system either set aside for evidence or for monitoring purposes. So, in general, we've had very few providers that have not pushed back. I can only think of maybe every once in a great while we'll have somebody push back. And again, depending on the severity of the issue that we're trying to tackle, that we'll either go through the law enforcement channel or we'll figure out another way to tackle that problem. So, basically, in general, it kind of covers, just some high-level topics that we're interested in, and also, one of the things that we wanted to focus on is general situational awareness. We're interested in general trends, trying to determine, again, what are the right thresholds, what makes sense of what the U.S. government should be aware of from a cyber attack or an event that might be taking place within your world that's impacting your customers or your organization.
Thanks, Jerry. The next person to comment will be Professor Robert Matthews from the University of Hawaii. Professor Matthews, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Martin. Can you hear me well?
Okay, we need to get the speakers turned up a little bit. Okay, how can you hear us now?
Can you hear me now? It's like a Verizon commercial.
So that's not sounded too good, audio folks.
Martin, can you hear me now?
Now we have you. So the question I'd like to pose to Professor Matthews, and by the way, good evening, Professor Matthews. In a global network operator community, one has certain local responsibilities specifically and certain communal responsibilities at the global level, both of which are essential parts of a responsible practitioner's manual. In an operational context, what are the distinct boundaries, major themes for each area as we understand and accept universally?
Nice boundaries.
So, did we drop the call? That figures, huh? He stayed on for almost an hour. And then
Martin, can you hear me?
yes,
Oh, yeah.
there you are, Professor Matthews.
All right. Thank you very much for having me, first of all. My colleagues and respected... Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Seems to be losing you in and out. All right. First, I'd like to assert a disclaimer. What I intend to share with you here has not been sanctioned in any manner by any arm of the United States government, the University of Hawaii, or any of its research concerns. The observations are strictly my own. Now we may proceed, I guess. I cannot speak specifically about any ongoing government program or those in the pipeline. Therefore, if there are questions from anyone regarding specific issues in that vein, it's probably best directed to someone else. Martin suggested that that I participate in the forum. So I said I may share with you some concerns from a high level, as in the 30,000 feet view, if you will. In my opinion, the nature of network security concerns in the nano community is a subset of a larger security concern in the national domain with respect to information systems. And of course, as Jerry Dixon just mentioned, these systems encompass various layers. I sort of divided in the context of civilian and military. Civilian to include banking and finance, transportation, electrical power, telecommunications, oil and gas, medical services, etc. And the military systems to include command and control communications systems, those systems that provide battle space awareness for command and control purposes, combat identification, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance systems. And again, with respect to those moving concerns within this particular session, I think consequences from failure in the national domain involve very large consequences, obviously, the compromise of national security command structure, military command, political command infrastructure failure, all leading to loss of life, compromised national security, and loss of public confidence, of course. I mean, we have now large industrial concerns associated with various aspects of information system security. I tend to suggest that the application security domain is one that's most familiar to everyone, operations system security. And there is interface point and system security, information systems or information security, ComSec. All of these are individually large concerns that have come up, when in reality we must really consider that overall security is a multi-dimensional property of the entire system. And as practitioners, we perhaps ought to step back and consider that and understand what one's role is in their multi-dimensional, in assuring a multi-dimensional property of the entire system. With respect to the pervasive nature of information systems, I tend to submit that going beyond what is known today with respect to getting more understanding of end-to-end system behavior, if you will require significantly large research breakthroughs, that which it is not being assaulted by any government research organism like NSF, DARPA, and others. Presently, methods to strengthen one dimension can easily compromise another, and we find that routinely. And one of the things with respect to trying to assure system components by virtue of applying finely tuned composability techniques has resisted determined efforts. This is something that we found out through government research. And another aspect of government research that we've come to understand so well is commercially available off-the-shelf technology neither provide a high level of assurance nor functions required to meet specific government needs. This is the ugly duckling that no one wants to talk about. and high assurance operating system R&D in the commercial sector is moribund. Simple. Let's consider another fact. For instance, the Department of Defense, for instance, has to place significant resources to analyzing each attempt to penetrate their network on a routine basis every day. This involves a very intense layer of forensic protocol, and these costs are enormous, simply staggering. I think it was in 2000, the year 2000, Art Money, then DoD CIO, stood in front of DEFCON 8 and said, we spent $25 billion in 1999 alone to track and qualify and quantify 22,000 obvious attacks against DoD systems. That averages out to about $1.5 million per attack. So the instituting forensics and going through that forensic protocol with respect to each of those attempts to penetrate systems is a significantly costly matter, none which we can just set aside when you talk about agency budgets. The other aspect from a operational security perspective we ought to consider is, we focus on network security metrics. And security metrics in particular is sort of a vague topic when we start talking about from one community to the next what we think of them as and what we understand them to be. What we need is holistic system metrics, that which we don't have at this point. When I mean by holistic system metrics, I'll give you an example by way of medicine. We know this relationship in medicine, for instance, and we know it because we know the systemic aspects of the system so well that the interrelationship between the many factors involved we've studied, we've assessed, we've qualified, quantified, and there are complex maps to that relationship. I wish to say that for every dollar cut in polio immunization costs, for instance, costs $10 later in medical costs, and that every $1 cut in measles, mumps, and rubella immunization programs costs $14 in medical costs later. And we know the relationships. From a systemic perspective, we don't understand it very well. When we talk about, for those practitioners of quality of service or those lovers of quality of service, for instance, quality of service is a wonderful tool. In as much as that is the case, it doesn't help us understand end-to-end system behavior. When I mean by end-to-end system behavior, it's not a node-to-node behavior. I'm talking about the network endpoints to the nth power, if you will, in that context. And when you have to be concerned about a qualitative context, you really must have those sort of measures at hand. Very significant problem. This is not something simple. And we have yet another problem with respect to DHS's evolving role, and other government entities' evolving role. You consider such things from a policy perspective, like Presidential Decision Directive 63 and its advancement, and the Homeland Security Department's Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2004, for instance. There is still a very large void in the industry-specific data on critical system component vulnerabilities, the likes of which can adequately result in mitigation of vast disruption of services. We don't have any detail on. We do not have sufficient data on critical information system infrastructure interdependencies, for instance. So therefore, again, I mean, in as much as we're talking about large-scale complex information systems in the United States government or critical infrastructures, those things are equally applicable to the Internet as well. And it's impressive when you look back. Research has resulted in understanding this. For 15% of the vulnerabilities, we have little vendor acknowledgement. For 20% of the vulnerabilities, we have we don't even know where to look for vulnerability information in government. This is a sort of problem that we're faced with. It's impressive, and so when we look at a practitioner versus a network owner, a network manager, and these domains of specialities, we ought to have common lexicality, and we ought to have standard terminology on how we go about understanding, defining, qualifying, quantifying, and enforcing security paradigms. We simply have a great deal of inconsistency in this regard. So those are the pieces of information that I wish to rest with, and maybe take questions and perhaps engage in some dialogue.
Thank you, Professor Matthews. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
How can we let him off easy?
Say what?
How can we let him off easy?
Okay, so we're running a little bit over here, and I'm looking at Steve and Susan and saying, we have a couple of questions on the IRC. Do you want me to take them or not? Okay, I need them. I don't have, do I have them up here? Yes. Okay, this question comes from Joel. I can't pronounce your last name at uoregon.edu. Yeagley, okay. Why are most affected companies and enterprises not managing bug fixes? That's the context. And if as the panel has advocated, disclosure information is limited in time frame and scope, how can companies make intelligent decisions about management of their infrastructure? Go ahead.
Mart, is that
I think that we
question for the panel?
Go ahead.
I think we answered a part of that at the end, in terms of there's obviously the whisper net that we hear a lot of information, and I think that a lot of us base a lot of trust on people who get the information before us and pass that information along. So I think we're making assumptions that thus far have panned out all right, that the information that we get is reliable.
Hello?
Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Go ahead, Professor Matthews. I think we're losing him.
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Hello?
Are we still hooked up?
Hello?
Not anymore.
Only because I don't know what's going on, and I didn't want him to keep saying hello, hello, over and over. Okay, the next question is from Jay Patel. How do you determine which providers should receive early notice of critical router vulnerabilities? For example, the recent Juniper LDP/MPLS related exploit. I think this comes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of how do you actually get these things out there and avoid the whisper network?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's an easy or right answer to that question.
Yeah, we don't have enough time to discuss that one here.
Yeah, there's certainly the belief from some folks that there's some networks or some customers that, like the government, for instance, will want answers about the vulnerability as early as possible because they like asking those questions. I don't think they ever really do anything useful with it, but they sure the heck like to ask the question. For operators, though, there's some folks that other networks will depend upon in order to get the fix. So if you have to go across TDS Telecom to get to Juniper, you probably want to make sure that TDS Telecom is okay. I mean, you might also look at Martin and say, I hope his DNS server works so I can look up.
Or you have your Etsy host primed.
Right. I mean, there's unfortunately, it's a very complicated answer, and I'm certainly not qualified to answer it, but not completely.
Yeah, I think I'll stay away from that one too.
Yeah.
Martin, I'm sorry that I lost you for a moment. I'm back on.
Okay, Professor Matthews, did you have a question as well?
No, if I failed to answer anyone's question, I just wanted to let you know that I departed from you for a short bit there. Line got dropped, and I had to dial back in.
Okay. We've actually gone to the point where we're taking the last question that we've received, and it's directed at one of the panel members. How do you make sure... What?
Yeah, question.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Actually, it's not a question, it's just a recommendation.
Can you speak up, please?
For the next panel you have, I'd like to hear the devil's advocate position. For example, on slide 1. I know we don't have time to discuss that now, but I know it's a controversial one, so just a suggestion for the next panel.
So you're suggesting that we, take somebody who has differing views? I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously several people who think that full disclosure immediately should be done.
That's why the audience is here.
And you are who from where?
Tristan Horn from CollabNet.
Thank you.
Okay, this is the last question that we can take, and it's from Jay again. How do you make sure that providers which represent a significant amount of traffic and customer base, but which are not on the radar because they're not tier 1s, and I believe he's referring to Skitter, or purchase refurbished network hardware and therefore do not maintain support contracts, or are otherwise trying to remain solvent, are informed in a timely fashion so that they have an opportunity to upgrade their networks before it's too late? And I don't really have an answer for that. I think that goes towards the first question, although I think discussing the Skitter data and its use as applied to this is useful, but again, another topic that
I think
is probably a lot more detail that we can go into right now.
Yeah, there was just one quick comment. There's an important point in his question, those who don't have support contracts.
Right.
If you don't have a support contract, the vendor really has no obligation to tell you anything. And I mean, I hate to say that because I have lots of stuff, my own personal things that have support contracts, but you know, that's the vendor. If you're looking for the vendor to tell you, they're not going to tell you unless you have a support contract, except for a couple of vendors who do public releases of information and fixes and provide the fix for free.
Do you think though that
not all?
Do you think though that there could or there may be an issue that, much like Microsoft gave SP2 out, that a network hardware vendor should give a release of code out to solve a major problem, regardless of your status?
Yeah, I think that Chris is right. Most do. I think I really don't want to speak out of turn because I don't work for the company.
Right.
But I think that at least one company that I know of doesn't. But that's something the vendors have to hash out among themselves. There's reasons why they want to keep support contracts around.
Okay, I don't see. I think we're done. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I'd like to thank Professor Matthews for joining us, Jerry Dixon. I'd like to thank Randy Bush and Steve Bellovin for some consultation on this panel. And I hope that we presented a rounded and well-balanced opinion from multiple sides of the House. This was, for the most part, pretty unscripted, and hopefully we gave you something to think about. Thank you.